So, the Book of Lamentations. How does this book start?
It starts with one word, in Hebrew, echa, which, and I'd be interested to hear, it comes out in two flavors. Sometimes it comes out as the interrogative, how? And so the opening line becomes like, how lonely sits the city? Mm-hmm. And I've always taken it as more of like a oi.
An exclamatory?
Yes, like, or you see it in text as alas.
Yeah.
But what it really is, I mean, I think it's basically, it's a genre marker. It's telling you what's coming next is not going to be nice.
Yeah. We do see these, like what we would call question words, right? Interrogatives that function in poems, in Hebrew poetry, as a way of like marking exclamation, mm-hmm. right? And you could think of, for example, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, right? Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods, mm-hmm. right? Here, how, echa, right? The elongated form is like how is this possible, mm-hmm. right? It's an exclamation of how can such horror, such tragedy, such destruction be possible?
Yeah. So let's step back for a second. What tragedy and what destruction? Because for all of, I mean, I don't think we have any doubt about it, but the text never actually says.
No, what does the text say?
I mean, it talks about the wall, it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, it talks about the...
By name.
By name, it talks about the exile. It never says Babylonia, right? It never names it refers to the people, the invaders who have come in, but it's, it falls into a more generic sense. Having said that, what it's really talking about is the destruction of the temple in 580.
6 or 7?
Somewhere in there. One of the two, nobody knows.
BCE.
Yes. Which the response, how is this possible, is sensible. Maybe it's hard for us.
It's both rhetorical and sincere.
Right.
Right? Because it's rhetorical in the sense that it doesn't ask for a response or an answer, but it's also sincere in the sense of, actually, how is this possible, right? The Book of Lamentations as one of many different biblical texts that are trying to make sense of the loss of the temple, the loss of the land, mm-hmm. and actually, most keenly, the loss of God's dwelling place amidst the people, right? God's actual personage, or I don't have a deity term for personage, deityage, among the people. So it's trying to think through those things. So it is also a genuine question. Unlike other poetic collections, it does not have an inscription in the Hebrew that ties it to a personage, right? A patron or a quote-unquote author, right? For Song of Songs, we have Solomon. For Proverbs, we have Solomon and a bunch of sundry other folks. Mm-hmm. Psalms, David, and sundry other folks.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the story. I was chatting with my mother-in-law, who said to me, she asked me what books I love. And I said, I love this one, I love that one, I love Lamentations. And her response was, oh, he had such a hard life, didn't he? And I honestly, it did. It took me a full beat to figure out that she meant Jeremiah, because...
Not Mr. Lamentations?
Not Mr. But the association of Jeremiah with Lamentations is, basically a historical one. Like, well, who was writing around that time? Jeremiah was writing around that time, and it sure doesn't sound like Ezekiel. So like, you know.
I mean, it's also a statement of, I mean, if we can think of the way these kinds of attributions function, like Solomon or like David, there is a kind of like genre or tone or set of themes that characters are attached to.
In Jeremiah, it's self-pity. Right. I mean, so, but, okay. You and I don't think Jeremiah wrote it, in part because we, like the idea of one person writing this, I mean, you already talked about it as a collection. It's 5 chapters, each of which, to my eye at least, seems to be quite distinctive.
And self-contained. I mean, there is actually a mechanism that contains each of the chapters as a, you know, a self-contained composition, which is the alphabetic acrostic. Right?
Yeah. How do you, I think lots of people read the alphabetic acrostic and it's like, first of all, I think readers in English often have no idea it's there because it's not represented in the translation. But
also, we have more than 22 letters.
Right. So, you know, what happened to, you know, W, X, Y, and Z? Why would somebody use an acrostic in this kind of poem?
Well, I mean, I can tell you some answers that are less satisfying, and then I'll give you the answer that I think is more satisfying.
Perfect.
I mean, so, you know, oftentimes acrostics are thought of as educational tools.
It's for memory.
For memory, or maybe just to teach you the alphabet. You know, such a lovely school song is Lamentations, right? We can talk about the cannibalism later, but the alphabetic acrostic has often been thought also as a kind of expression of completeness, right? Yeah. A to Z, right? Alpha to omega, if you will. Okay. Yep. I also don't find that to be a satisfying way of thinking about how the acrostic functions in Lamentations. I think that maybe if we were to think of a poem that's trying to talk about the completeness of, you know, beauty or the completeness of anything, right? But destruction and horror and trauma, we don't think in terms of completeness. We think in terms of the cyclical experience of grief. And so to me, there's this idea that grief and trauma cannot be contained. And so one must use some kind of arbitrary containing device.
Given the freedom to express my grief, it would be never ending.
Yeah, it would be endless, right? And this is a way of putting a pin in it, so to speak. So, I mean, that's one way of thinking about the alphabetic acrostic. But the other way of thinking about it is that, I mean, and one can think about the way grief, you know, people experience grief, not all at once and not with a clear beginning and end point, right? And so it starts and it ends and then it starts up again, right? With varying intensity. And I think, to my mind, what's also really interesting about the way the alphabetic acrostic works in the various poems in Lamentations is that, you know, the longest chapter, the 3rd chapter, has 3 for each letter. Yeah. It's kind of like, and it's interesting that that's placed in the dead center of the work as a way of really clarifying the grief. Although we can argue about whether it's appropriate, the voicing of that.
We'll talk about it later.
We'll talk about that. But the alphabetic acrostic, too, is interesting for other reasons. The 5th chapter.
Not an acrostic.
Not an acrostic. Nevertheless, 22 lines, right? You know, I may be overreading here, but something about the jumbling of grief that happens, you know, that it's not orderly, that it becomes disordered, right?
Yeah.
That's one way of thinking about it. Another thing that's actually kind of just like a cool little tidbit is that the order of the alphabet is different in chapters 2, 3, and 4 than it is in chapter 1. Pei and Ayin. So the older, if I'm recalling this correctly, the older alphabetic sequence is Pei and then
Pei
Ayin.
and then Ayin.
Right? And then the later, chronologically later alphabetic sequence is Ayin and then Pei. And only chapter 1 has that later, almost as a framing, right?
Yeah, and also as a tidbit, right? That we know that because we have all these fun inscriptions from ancient Israel of like people practicing the alphabet.
Abecedaries, yeah.
Right, and sometimes those letters in one order, and sometimes they're in another. So
Yeah.
like we can see that it wasn't fixed.
It wasn't fixed. Crazy idea, but one way of also thinking about it is I tend to think that while there are definitely kind of textual corruptions and errors that we can see in all kinds of ancient manuscripts, manuscript traditions, if one were to just think about the deliberate way in which the alphabet is used in the Book of Lamentations as a way of thinking about times before to use an older order of the alphabet. Just a thought.
So as we're talking about this, we're talking about like the need to contain grief. We're talking about like historical sort of orders of alphabets. It's very typical to imagine that this text is like almost like reporting, like it's on the scene at the destruction of the temple. Like this is from 586, like November, whenever. like it's actually from the moment. How do you think about like, or how might we think about the relationship between the historical event of the destruction and this poetry that seems to be so like viscerally attuned to that moment? Do we need to think of it as actually of that moment?
One of the things I tend to think about with Lamentations is the various forms, literary forms that it blends. So, one that obviously comes to mind is the funerary dirge. Another would be the Mesopotamian city lament. Mm-hmm. And the Mesopotamian city laments were not written in the wake of destruction, but rather at the rededication of a temple. And so even though it speaks in the voice of the destruction, right, it's actually marking a rebirth. And so there's something sort of interesting, and that's not to say that that's how I read Lamentations. That is the form that is being engaged and possibly upended within Lamentations itself. It is conscious of existing literary genre, and it's responding to it in a way, and using some of its like mechanisms for meaning making.
Yeah, we'll talk about this more next time, but I think that one of the things that Lamentations also does, not just uses form, I think it draws very openly on pre-existing, what we now know as biblical, but pre-existing literature and ideas about, especially ideas about, God's role, or like how we previously understood things to be that have now been upended. But that same kind of taking of earlier material speaks to a kind of thoughtfulness that one doesn't associate with like the immediacy of grief. Lamentations, as you said, presents itself as immediately grieving, but it's still literature.